Okay, so for this last video, I want to talk a little bit more about disjunction. Here, we're seeing some disjunct distributions of the flightless retites lineage, which is the ostriches and emus and those groups. And they were originally thought to be due to vicariance. So the fact that they were disjunct was thought to originally have been due to vicariance. But some recent studies suggest that it may actually be the result of dispersal events followed by repeated evolution of flightless forms. So basically, ancestors of this group could fly and disperse to these locations, and then over several repeated events, independently evolved the flightlessness, basically lost the ability to fly. This is a disjunct distribution of the lungless salamander, and it has some pretty remarkably isolated population. So here you can see, like in this Mediterranean region, there's a disjunct population, and then there's populations throughout the eastern United States. There's some disjunct populations of this group in the western United States, and then also in Central in South America. So some of these can be, really widespread, and some disjunct populations can be highly isolated. Um, so here we're seeing some amphitropical plant species. So that just means amphitropical just means that there are populations in both the northern hemisphere and in the southern hemisphere. And a recent analysis of the distributions of these plants indicated that there was a strong bias of dispersal from the north to the south. So basically, species that were found in both northern and southern hemispheres tended to get that way by dispersal from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere. Here's a disjunct population of the fringe-toed lizard, the genus Uma, and it's restricted to sand dunes in the desert region of southwestern North America. So here you can see some of those, the Mojave fringe-toed lizard up here. The Coachella Valley fringe-toed lizard has a much more isolated geographic range, and then the Colorado desert fringe-toed lizard here. And again, that's sort of going back to this pattern where with disjunct and even within provincialism, you see these highly related species that have closely either overlapping or adjacent geographic range. And so if we're looking at disjunct populations, we usually want to know how they got that way. And there's three distinct processes. I mean, these are really the only way that a species or a population or any group can become disjunct is through one of these. It's either by tectonic movement separating continents or islands. It's either by extinction, where you had, an entire intact range, and then for some reason there was a split or an extinction event that occurred for a portion of them and separated two areas now. So basically you had a continuous, and then some, like in the middle, some populations went extinct and it's no longer continuous. Or it can be disjunct by dispersal. So you could have a barrier that some individuals are able to disperse over, and then you have two disjunct populations. So these are the only three ways that a population can become disjunct. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about it's an event called the Great American Biotic Exchange. And what this basically is that during a portion of geologic history, there was a large exchange of biodiversity between the North American and South American continents through here. And we see this in the evolutionary history of the lineages that are found in each continent now. If we wanted to put this in historical context, I'm not going to read through all of this, but basically About 2.5 to 3.5 million years ago, there was the emergence of this Central American land bridge. So you had this land bridge that formed that connected those two in Central America. Before that was basically all these events that there was connection, and then the connections were gone, and then the connections came back. So there was this periodicity or this cyclical nature where there was where the continents were isolated or connected, basically oscillating between being connected and isolated several times before a more permanent central land bridge formed. And it's worth mentioning, we're sort of looking at the time period around here, like during the Pleistocene, which we've talked about. There was a lot of this movement back and forth between these two continents. But this isn't the only time this has happened, and that's not the only location that this has happened. There's been lots of sort of bursts of this exchange between areas of biodiversity in different areas and in different times. And we're not going to go through all of these. I want to focus mainly on this one. So here we're looking at, here's this formation of the Central American land bridge. And when it formed, it basically acted as a dispersal filter that allowed more species with northern ancestry to disperse south than it did the inverse. So more species went south than did go north. But basically you had this filter zone. If you remember back when we talked about what a dispersal filter is, and what happened was you had all of these groups of organisms that were able to cross from the north to the south, basically from Northern America to South America, all of these organisms. And then you had a number of organisms that were stopped. Basically, the filter prevented these organisms from crossing. If we look at the opposite side of that, there was these organisms were able to disperse from the south to the north, and these organisms were stopped. And there's been a lot of studies that look at like possibly what could be the reason for this, and it's not really conclusive at this point. There's a lot of different hypotheses, but I think it's still an active area of research as far as determining what exactly allowed this filter, or this area, to be a filter for some organisms and not for others. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about here is convergence and the convergence of biotas. So just to kind of give this definition, convergent evolution refers to the phenomenon of unrelated organisms independently evolving similar traits due to similar environmental pressures. So here we're looking at convergence of leaf morphology of distantly related plant species from evergreen shrub habitats in Mediterranean climates. So basically, within different areas, so different parts of the world have similar sort of Mediterranean-like climates, and anywhere we look at the plant communities within those climates, we see similarities across morphology types. So if we look at South Africa, Sardinia, Chile, or California, we see these groups of plants that form similar morphology types, and it's basically due to the fact that they have similar evolutionary pressures. Like there's strong evolutionary controls over the shape of a leaf that can influence, you're trying to, if you're a plant and you have leaves that are your photosynthetic energy source, you're trying to maximize your leaf area while minimizing surface area so that you don't lose so much water to the atmosphere. So you want to conserve how much water you have while maximizing your photosynthetic capabilities. So that tends to produce similar types of leaf morphology, and we can see lots of similarities when we look at these types of climates. Convergent evolution here in the morphology of 5 different groups of rodents and 1 extinct, spelled that wrong, extinct marsupial from deserts throughout the world. So basically these are small mammals, and these are found in desert locations, and they are found, for one, they are very distantly related. They're not closely related, and they're found very far away from each other. And so there's no real evolutionary or spatial relationship to these, but the similarities are the environments where they're found. And so they've evolved very similar morphology types where they have these long tails, they have these long hind limbs, and short front limbs, and some of their coloring, which this is in black and white, but similar as well. And so basically you just have the same sorts of evolutionary pressures on these types of organisms converging on similar morphology types. Something that's worth mentioning is that convergence in higher taxa is kind of difficult to identify. So convergent evolution is something that happens all the time, and we can identify it in individual species, but if we want to identify it in higher groups, it's a little more difficult. And usually when it's reported, the instances don't necessarily reflect the different groups that the different groups have different ecological niche characteristics. So here we're seeing sort of a comparison of placentals in North America to marsupials in Australia. And they're sort of making the case that, oh, look at this convergent evolution. It can be a little misleading. First of all, diagrams like this tend to overestimate the similarities. These are not drawn to scale, and so these organisms, these groups of organisms, are not the same size. So there's large size differences. But there's something else that maybe is even more important or more worth noting, and that's that if we compare Australia as a whole to North America as a whole, it's pretty different. We wouldn't really expect that the organisms found in one would represent convergent evolution in these two. Basically, the evolutionary pressures are probably not going to be that similar on broad scales in North America as they are in Australia. First of all, Australia is a lot smaller than North America. But maybe more importantly is that Australia is a much more tropical continent than North America. Obviously, this diagram is not showing them where they actually are. It's meant so you can make this comparison. And basically, the tropical latitudes run right through the center of Australia, whereas almost the entirety of North America is above the tropical latitude. So the climates are not going to be similar at all. And we know that intuitively about Australia compared to North America. And so we wouldn't really expect that the organisms are occupying the same niche, even if they might look a little bit similar. We probably would want to hesitate to consider those to be evidence of convergent evolution, because the evolutionary pressures are probably pretty different between these two continents. So it's a little bit trickier when you're trying to move beyond the species level to identify convergent evolution. Not that it doesn't occur at those scales, it's just you want to be more scrutinous if you're going to make those claims. Okay, so this is the last video there for this module. There's one more reading, so do that reading, keep working your way through the module, and then get to the assignment. And I will see you in next week's videos. Oh, one last thing here. This should be yellow. I don't know why this isn't yellow. Anyway, just to sort of summarize what we talked about here, we introduced these ideas of cosmopolitanism and endemism. We talked about the Great American Biotic Exchange, and really what we're getting at here is the diversity of life on Earth reflects the outcome of opposing forces, both promoting convergence and divergence. So similar evolutionary pressures can cause convergence towards similar morphology types, but also isolation can cause divergence of different types of organisms. So both of these forces are in play almost all the time. So some interesting things going on there. Okay, I will wrap this up, and I will see you in next week's video.